So we are now in Ezekiel chapter 38, and look what God says. After he gives us Ezekiel 37, all Israel was blinded in the past, died blinded. Now all of a sudden they are resurrected and God's Spirit is put in them. They are converted. And now, all of a sudden, notice Ezekiel 38, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog, of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, and prophesy against them. Now, of course, brethren, Magog was one of the sons of Japheth, as everyone in this chapter is either one of the sons of Japheth or one of the sons of Ham together. So they're together. Now the word, the prince of Rosh, the prince of Rosh is exact translation from the Hebrew. In the Old King James, it says, the chief prince of Meshech. So the word the chief is the word Rosh in Hebrew. Is the word Rosh in Hebrew. Here in the New King James, it clearly says the prince of Rosh. R-O-S-H, Rosh. Now, of course, the word Rosh is, as you can well suppose, is the root word of the word Russia. So here it is talking about Asiatic hordes. Gog, the land of Magog, Rosh, Meshech, which is also the word Moscow, and Tubal. Verse 3, and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Now, Meshech and Tubal are two people of modern day Russia, my dear friends. They are descendants of Japheth. They are a Caucasian people, an Asiatic, Oriental people, Sino-Russian, which is Chinese and Russian. Verse 4, I'll turn you around, put hooks into your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses, and horsemen, and splendidly clothed, a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Now, you see, these are the nations that the devil gathers together after the millennium and brings them against the camp of the saints. Now, because people haven't kept the holidays, they have not understood the prophecy. What, no wonder. And you can never understand the prophecy unless you keep and understand the holidays that God commanded in His Word. And then now we see the company of nations that are coming with these Sino-Chinese alliance, we might say. So verse 5, it says Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Now Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, they're the descendants of Ham, you see. So the whole area of Persia is united together with them, you see, then Ethiopia and Libya. And interestingly enough, when the beast power comes sweeping down through the Middle East and gets to Egypt, it is ready to step on Ethiopia and Libya. And yet, in Ezekiel 38, when he talks about these nations coming marching against God's people, here is Ethiopia and Libya with them. And all of them with shield and helmet. So, brethren, apparently, Egypt has learned its lesson from Zechariah 14, when they would come up to keep the feast of, and God when they would not come up to keep the feast, that is, and God would then shut off their rain. So there will be no crops, of course, and they wouldn't come up, and God shut off their rain until finally He poured plagues upon them, and they came up, you see, to keep the feast. But apparently, others are not going to do it. Others are not going to learn the lesson. They're still going to be rebellious. So here is Ethiopia and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Then it continues to show us who else is in this great multitude of Gog and Magog, rebellious against God at the end of the millennium, at the end of the 1,000 years. Verse 6, Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarma, from the far north, and all its troops, many people are with you. So see, the emphasis is numbers. Many people. Verse 7, prepare yourself and be ready, you and all your companies that are gathered about you, and be a guard for them. After many days you'll be visited, In the latter years you'll come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. This is the reunited, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, having one king over them, King David. So these rebellious armies are going to, obviously with the intention to plunder and occupy the Holy Land, and they think that they will then rule the world. So, here the prophet is talking about God's people Israel after they're brought back from the sword. Many days after they are brought back from the sword, in the latter years of what? In the latter years, but after God's people are brought back from the sword, they enter into that land. And after they're brought back from the sword is, we have the gathering they're gathered from many people. They're gathered now, they're gathered in their own land. They live peacefully, safely, they have no locks, they have no fear of any invasion, because they're converted people, they rely now on God for their safety. And this verse 8, actually describes a few years into the millennium, when God is working with the house of Israel. So God is not yet working with other people except as they believe. In this present time. So the setting in the time period here is after Israel is already brought back from their captivity, which is imminent and will happen very soon. And it will be brought about through the descendants of ancient Assyrians, and the descendants of ancient Assyrians are Germans. So the setting again is the time period here after Israel is already brought back from their captivity. They're brought back into their land, to their soil, Adamah, and then some of these nations try to fight, perhaps at the beginning of the millennium, but certainly at the end of the millennium. Because at the end of the millennium, Satan is released to gather them for that battle. So we have learned that from Revelation chapter 20, and we learned that from drawing parallel between Revelation 20 and Ezekiel 37. Now we find in Revelation the second woe, which is actually a war to end all wars. These attackers are probably a remnant of these people. They are going to attack God's people. God permits this battle to take place. 1/6 of those attacking nations will be left. And finally, when God as we read in Revelation 20, sends fire from heaven to destroy them, finally those who are left of those nations are finally, their rebellion is crushed, and they're finally now submitted to the eternal. Verse 9, you will, all those armies, Gog and Magog, you will ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud. You and all your troops and many peoples with you. Thus says the Lord God. On that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. Oh, so here is the devil's influence on him, you see. Here is Satan the devil instigating him, trying to use him to encompass the camp of the saints about, and you have got inspiration or an influence, and you think an evil thing, an evil plan, and verse 11 you will say, I'll go up against the land of unwalled villages, I'll go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. You see, total security. And that is indeed a millennial setting there, brethren, without any question. Verse 11 is talking about the millennium. Unwalled villages at rest. Peaceful people. The word peaceful is used many times in the Bible symbolically to portray the Sabbath rest. It is the word shakat. Shakat. It represents 1,000 years rest. So here, the nations of Israel are dwelling safely. All the 12 tribes regathered, joined together as one nation, dwelling safely. They're at rest. They live in unwalled villages. So that is certainly not talking about the Asiatic hordes coming at Israel when they're armed and walled and fighting and militarily might. So it's not about the modern Israel at this time, the state of Israel. No, this is about the future Israel in the millennium. And that is not talking about the coming battle between the Americans and the Russians, or the Russians and the Israelites at all. Some people misunderstand, sadly. They keep thinking that one of these days Russia and America will be at war. No, they will not be. It's not in the Bible prophecy. They also think that Russians will probably wage war with the modern day state of Israel. No, they will not. This verse is talking about the time of the millennium. It is talking about Satan's instigation of this Gog and Magog, rebelling against the camp of the saints at the end of the millennium. And perhaps trying to fight God and resist God's government at the beginning of the millennium, but most certainly at the end of the millennium, when Satan will be released for a short time. Verse 12, they're coming to do what? To take plunder and to take beauty, to stretch out your hand against the waste places that are again inhabited, and against a people gathered from the nations who have acquired livestock and goods, who dwell in the midst of the land. So there is no question. The setting is after Israel has been captive and punished, and they are brought back to the promised land. Then this trouble is going to come upon them. So God's glory will be made known to the heathens as the result, because this battle is not to be confused with the last battle at Christ's return, when Satan is still loose. This battle occurs at the end of 1,000 years, when Satan will be released for a short while. Then we have, in verse 13, Sheba, Dedan, the merchants of Tarshish, and all their young lions will say to you, have you come to take plunder? Have you gathered your army to take booty, to carry away silver and gold, to take away livestock and goods, to take great plunder? Now Sheba, Dedan, and the merchants of Tarshish, here he is talking about Arabian and the Japanese. The merchants of Tarshish are here the Japanese. And they are with all their young lions. That is talking about young nations. Not the old lions, but the new nations that have been there. Verse 14, therefore, son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, thus says the Lord God, on that day, when my people Israel dwells safely, will you not know it? In other words, are you not going to recognize that God is the God of the world? That God is a God who chastened and those so-called Christian nations, the house of Israel. Now they have learned their lessons, and God has brought them back to their land, and His name is glorified among them. On that day, are you going to know that? Are you not going to admit it? Are you not? But obviously, regardless of the fact that all those rebels have seen as eyewitnesses that what God has done with His people Israel, obviously that hasn't really affected their minds and hearts. They remain unconverted. So God says, you're atheistic, you're agnostic, and you're not going to admit it by all that has taken place, that God is God. Well, are you not going to admit it? No, they're not. And those nations of the house of Israel were God's nations. Are you not going to admit it? No, they will not admit it, And they'll come in this great rebellion, and they're going to be punished, crushed, and destroyed by fire. Verse 15. Then you will come from your place out of the far north, and you and many people with you, all of them riding on horses, a great company and a mighty army. You'll come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. It will be in the latter days that I will bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am hallowed in you, O Gog, before their eyes. So the reason, you see, better, that God is going to chasten them, and the reason that God is going to battle them, indeed, you see, the way that is described, the reason is so that that He is going to be sanctified in them. So those types of descriptions, they seem to imply that those countries that are described in this chapter, that those countries are coming at the beginning of the millennium, and God fights them and chastens them, and then becomes known through them. But others don't admit that God is God. So at the end of the millennium, they're still rebellious enough that Satan can go out and lead the number of them against God. It has to be, we have read that in Revelation 20, verse 17, in Ezekiel 38. Thus says the Lord God, are you he of whom I have spoken in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel, who prophesied for years in those days that I would bring you against them? So you see, brethren, even God's books of prophecies, in his books, he has the prophecies about these same nations mentioned in this very chapter that we are reading right now. Then verse 18 says, and it will come to pass at the same time, when Gog comes against the land of Israel, says the Lord God, that my fury will show in my face, for in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath I have spoken. Surely in that day shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, so that the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that creep on the earth, and all men who are on the face of the earth shall shake at my presence. The mountains shall be thrown down, the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground. So here is the supernatural fear that is brought on by the earthquake and signs in the heavens and Christ's return. You see, the mountains shall be thrown down, either nations brought down under God's government, are literal earthquakes. The steep places shall fall as well as every wall. So God is putting an end to all the battles of men, to all the walls of defense, and to all the nations all the nations in their lawless state of beings. Verse 21, I'll call for a sword against Gog through all my mountains, says the Lord God. Every man's sword will be against his brother, and I'll bring him to judgment with pestilence and bloodshed. I'll rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. Well, seemingly like Zechariah 14, there that God deals with them with a plague, so that the punishment of these powers is exactly likened to what it is in Revelation. It's supernatural. It's coming from God. Hailstones, fire and brimstone and flooding rain, like they came down on Sodom and Gomorrah. So this is the judgment of God. So, again, all these things, flooding rain like came down on Sodom and Gomorrah. So that is a supernatural punishment and judgment on them. Verse 23, thus I'll magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I'll be known in the eyes of many nations. Then they shall know that I am the Lord. So you see, apparently by the power of these peoples recognized of war and chastening and punishment, God magnifies himself even in the eyes of these heathen and sanctifies himself and will be known in the eyes of many nations. But brethren, we notice, even though he says, I'll be known in the eyes of many nations, there are still going to be rebellious nations at the end of the millennium. Now, that is hard to imagine. Indeed, that's hard to imagine that God is on the earth ruling and sons of God are ruling all over the earth, and yet at the end of 1,000 years, there still will be rebels against God. Well, even without the devil being here for 1,000 years, there still will be rebels. Incredible. It makes us realize, however, how steep, crooked human nature is.